Hello, greetings from Museo Camera, the Center for the Photographic Arts. It's been my great love for almost 40 years now, the art of photography, the science of image making, the endless possibilities that technological changes have brought and taken away from us. Many people of my generation who started as die-hard analog buffs have had a long and exciting journey, traversing from silver grains to storage devices, film rolls to memory cards, and formats measured in millimeters and described in megapixels. Today, I have a personal collection of 2000 plus antique cameras and other allied gadgets dating back to the 1860s, collected from over 100 countries. Coming from the background of photographic practice and being a collector and connoisseur of the vintage and early photography, in my quest and inquiry, I have been fascinated by the role of technology and the minimal and insignificant acknowledgement of the same in all the academic papers. I feel it can be safely attributed to the fact that very few academics have tried to understand the complexity of the photographic technology and have resorted to just commenting on the visible layer of the image, while the invisible layers have been relegated to a very inconsequential role. The image has so many layers, and some of the most interesting ones are buried in the processes of its creation. My work traverses across many formats and processes, from vintage to analog, from glass plates, egg albumen, cyanotypes, gum bichromate, and salt prints, to the best of megapixels, exploring the history of photography. The journey of this medium from silver grain to megapixel itself is a narrative waiting to be explored. Since the last few years, I have been immersed in the making of the Museo Camera. It's an institution that celebrates the historicity of photography and its evolution. Today, the Museo Camera is reality, a space of 18,000 square feet spread over 0.75 acre of prime land in the heart of Gurgaon, dedicated to photography. Museo Camera is an institution that celebrates photography in all its avatars, irrespective of genres. It is crucial to know about the evolution of photography, both in terms of technology as well as creativity, besides aesthetics. Technology continues to alter our visual experience and even shape our activities. Though the present digital avatar is very important, it is essential to contextualize it with the silver grain moments. Photography evolved with technological advances that changed the look of the image from one era to another. It's been a long journey for me, spanning 40 years of collecting artifacts, ephemera, while working as a practitioner. They mark some of the most critical moments in the history of photography. Last few years, I've been totally immersed in the making of the museum. This dream of mine has been made possible by active support of friends, colleagues, fellow photographers, and many more anonymous well-wishers. The entire museum interiors have been crowdfunded. I can proudly say that I have created one of the most unique and one of the most largest museums in Southeast Asia dedicated to photography. The story of photography can be safely attributed to camera obscura. Camera obscura was essentially a dark closed space in the shape of a box with hole on one side of it. In the middle of 16th century, an Italian scholar wrote an essay on how to use camera obscura to make the drawing process easier. He projected the image of people outside the camera obscura on the canvas inside of it and then traced. Painters like Vermeer created some of their most famous paintings using camera obscura. The masterpiece Girl with the Pearl by Vermeer was created with the help of camera obscura. There are many books available on this which actually go on to prove how he created his famous images. This is a prototype of camera obscura where actually people can trace and create images on tracing paper. Journey of photography from silver grains to megapixels. Silver was used in photography from the very start of the 19th century. In the year 1800, the British photographer Thomas Wedgwood used paper or white leather, treated it with silver to capture an image. Historically, photography has been developed through constant processes of adjustment and improvement by different inventors. I have seized the light, captured its flight. The famous words of Daguerre when he announced his process daguerreotype to the world. It was Nicéphore Niepce who created the world's first image using bitumen of Judea and lavender oil. A Frenchman who actually created the world's first image. 19th August 1839, Louis Daguerre announced his invention to the world, the daguerreotype. The French government took away the patent and gifted it to the mankind. Louis Daguerre was a painter, architect and theatre designer by training. He was dissatisfied with the limitations of his art and sought to create a realistic representation of nature. Daguerre evolved a process to create a latent, fixed image by 1836-37. This later came to be known as daguerreotype. The image was produced on a silver-plated copper plate, polished to a mirror finish. The plate was made light sensitive in a specialized light-proof box with iodine and bromine fumes. It was exposed in camera and developed over hot mercury vapor. The image was fixed in a sodium thiosulfide and then washed with distilled water. However, daguerreotypes required long exposure times. This placed restrictions on the choice of subjects. The slightest movement resulted in blurred image. In portrait photography, the subject had to be held still, sometimes with special rests to aid postures. Daguerreotype could not be reproduced and they were easily scratched and had to be carefully protected in cases. Daguerreotype was the first popular form of photography and masses were heading for the studios to get their likeness done. The beauty, the detailing of daguerreotype could not be surpassed by any other medium. Upon seeing the first daguerreotype around 1840, the French painter Delaroche declared, "From today painting is dead." Painting did not die that day, but photography was born, disrupting the world and its social order through the creation of new ways to see, understand and explore. It was Sir William Herschel who coined the word photography, writing with light. And he also invented sodium thiosulfide, one of the most important chemicals used to fix the image onto any surface, popularly known as hypo. William Henry Fox Talbot. He is the person who created the world's first negative. Because daguerreotype was unreplicable, they needed something called negative. And the word negative and positive, which was coined by Talbot's friend Herschel, and Talbot actually created the world's first negative. People of India. The People of India is an 8-volume publication compiled by John Forbes, Watson and John William. What I am holding in my hand are probably one of the oldest photographic body of work. This was the first photographic documentation of the ethnography of India and one of the first early experiments with photography as a documentary medium. What started as Lord Canning's desire to possess photographs of natives Indians as a personal souvenir collection became an official British government publication in the course of time. The People of India. The books contained 468 annotated albumen prints. Only 200 sets were ever made. The project was commissioned under the patronage of Governor General Lord Canning and his wife, Lady Canning, both of whom were great early patrons of photography in India. These photographs portray the people of many castes, culture, groups, and occupation, posed individually and in groups. These images were created using wet plate collodion process, an early photography process which required photography material to be coated on glass plates, sensitized, developed within a span of 15 minutes, requiring a portable darkroom for use in the field. The low sensitivity, typically ISO 3, required minute-long exposures. Come, get your likeness done. This is how daguerreotypes were announced to the world. Daguerreotypes were unique, non-replicable, and with the introduction of carte de visits, visiting cards, in the late 1850s, photographic images could be produced cheaply, easily, and distributed. Carte de visits were prints, usually albumin prints, affixed to a card, measuring about 6 by 10 centimeters. Carte de visits were mostly popular from the 1860s to 1890s. It also marked the growing relationship between the 19th century middle class and the photographic medium. The middle class, who could not afford painted portraits of theirs, families and their loved ones, turned to photography. Photographic portraits became so popular that by early 1850s, Parisian studios were producing more than 1 lakh images per year. One of the most important genres of photography and a driving force has been portraiture. With the coming of photography and the ease of obtaining a good image, it replaced painting. The style of these early works reflected the technical challenges associated with long exposure times and the painterly aesthetics of the time. Within few months of photography arriving in India, one of the earliest photographic studios in India was opened by Bourne and Shepherd in Kolkata. Studio was started by British photographers Samuel Bourne and Charles Shepherd, portrait photographers. Advances in photographic equipment and techniques gave photographers the ability to capture images with shorter exposure time and the making of portraits outside the studio. 19th century photographic studios relied on daylight for illumination. To keep exposures time to minimum, they had glass roofs and walls, movable blinds and curtains, and which allowed the photographer to control the amount of light besides the direction of light. So this timeline traces the history of photography, the major practitioners, inventions, right from 1827 when the first image was taken by Nicéphore Niepce in France, and it marks the various important photographers, events, inventions, and art forms like pictorialism. So 1885, pictorialism, how things evolved, and lenses, aperture, shutters. Coming of Indian photography, Kulwant Roy started his photography in 1930s. Important photographers like Sunil Jana, Kishore Parekh. So we end in 2010 with the launching of Instagram. So one of the most important brands and iconic camera in the journey of photography is Kodak, which was actually manufactured by George Eastman, and who was actually a banker and photography was his hobby, and he made it into a passion, a business, and created some of the most iconic cameras. What does the word Kodak mean? The letter K was favorite of George Eastman, and he said that it seemed to be a strong, incisive sort of letter. He and his mother created the word Kodak, and when he was asked, what does it mean? He wrote to the British Patent Office explaining the name. He said, Kodak is not a foreign name or word. It was constructed by me to serve a definite purpose. It has the following merits as a trademark word. It is short, it is not capable of mispronunciation, and it does not resemble anything in the art and cannot be associated with anything in the art except the Kodak. One of the most iconic camera manufactured by Kodak was Kodak Brownie, a $1 camera which actually revolutionized photography, which made it so democratic. And the whole aim behind creation of Brownie was Eastman wanted it to be available to every household. Eastman revolutionized photography by making it so simple, by making it so easy, and making it available to the masses. By introducing the roll film and removing the complications of loading the glass plate and processing. So 1839, French gifted the photography to the world. Subsequently, the English refined it, and post 1880s, Americans created a world's biggest market by creating a brand called Kodak. Graflex was one of the world's most popular press camera, studio camera, and it was a professional camera which was very versatile, you could shoot on many formats, roll film, sheet film. They had features which were way ahead of their time. So this company, which was an independent company, was actually acquired by Eastman under the Kodak umbrella. From 1901 onwards, all the photojournalism, explorations were documented using Graflex cameras. So Graflex were also known as speed graphics subsequently. Why? Because you could operate them much faster compared to a normal camera. So these are some of the iconic speed graphic cameras which were used by event photographers to shoot marriages, and by photojournalists and documentary photographers. Zeiss Icon was another legendary camera. This is in fact my Zeiss Icon from 1970s, and this is how I started photography. 120mm camera with all the basic features on the lens. Everybody from my generation would know this camera, Agfa Click 3, which was one of the most popular cameras made in India, which used to cost I think around 300 rupees. 120mm roll, which used to give us 12 shots, and it had only 3 settings: shades, sun, and cloud. TLR stands for twin lens reflex, and twin lens reflex came before the SLRs, which is single lens reflex, and these were very popular. So there was one lens to see and there was another lens to take the picture. These cameras had a little bit of issue, which is an issue of parallax. What you actually saw through this lens, the seeing lens, was not exactly what you got on your frame. Century Graphic, which was announced to the world the turn of the century in 1900, was one of the most popular studio cameras. Typically, it shot images on glass plates. Many formats were possible on this camera. It was very bulky, It required many people to move around. It had wheels, and typically there was no shutter, and the shutter was just the cap which was moved to expose. So what I'm holding is one of the most ancient forms of shutter. This is where much before the focal plane shutters and all kind of shutters were invented. Shutter was just either a cap or a disc which was moved to cover the lens. And why it was possible to do something like that was because the ISO typically was ISO 2, ISO 3, ISO 4 of the glass plates. So they required very long exposures. Since the exposure was very long, you didn't need a fast shutter. So these are the original apertures from 1850. They were known as Waterhouse tops because they were invented by John Waterhouse in the late 1850s. So this system used plates with different apertures, holes, that could be put into a slot in the lens barrel as is seen there. The world of flash started something like this. They used to burn magnesium powder to create light. So by 1900s, they actually invented flashlights like this which used bulbs. These were one-off bulbs which were inserted in the flash, and they could be fixed on your camera or they could be held independently. So today most of us don't use light meters. Light meters are built in our cameras, but 100 years back they invented so many different light meters to calculate the amount of light required for a perfect exposure. They had calculation sheets, charts, what probably we would call cheat sheets, and some very complicated devices which used to allow them to calculate the amount of light required for a perfect image. Since the inception of photography in the early 19th century, darkrooms have evolved from wagons, tents to elaborate labs. In the early days, many photographers used portable darkrooms or dark tents. A photographer using the collodion process and wet plate had to coat and develop the images immediately and needed a darkroom at sight. In the 1870s, with the invention of dry plates, mobile darkrooms were not required anymore. So darkrooms have evolved into what all of you know today as Lightroom. This is Bessa, one of the most iconic Voigtlander camera ever manufactured. Voigtlander is one of the oldest names in photography. Founded in 1756 in Austria as a mechanical and optical shop. After the daguerreotype process was announced in 1839, these two iconic and very infamous images from August 6, 1945 and August 9, 1945 of dropping of the atom bomb was shot with the help of this camera, K20. This camera was specially manufactured to shoot the aerial images while they were doing reconnaissance or dropping bombs. You may wonder, why do these cameras have two lenses? But believe me, the idea of stereo photography goes back to 1880s. They created these cameras which could create 3D images. It uses the same principle as human eye. The camera captures two images which are, when you look through a stereoscope, they are assembled to give you that sense of depth. So the idea of spy cameras goes back to 19th century, and in 1907 they actually invented this camera called Tikka, which is a spy camera and which also is like a watch. And similarly they created many miniature cameras going back to early century. A very important camera which led to the decisive movement The word decisive movement, which was coined by Henri Cartier-Bresson, Bresson used this camera, and this was a very popular camera with all the street photographers, photojournalists. And why? Because it was very quiet. You could actually shoot very discreetly. It was tough. A lot of war photographers like Robert Capa used it to capture some of those iconic images, like the falling Spanish soldier. In 1947, Edwin Land created the world's first Polaroid camera, and the story of instant photography started. Today, of course, instant is in the form of pixels, but the story of photography carries on, and we have hundreds and hundreds of more cameras which trace the journey of photography. We look forward to seeing you at the Museo cameras soon.